quake's epicenter is 65 kilometers off Japan's east coast, where a 300-kilometer section of the Earth's crust is pushed upwards by about 5 meters. It's a seismic event known as an undersea megathrust earthquake. The force of the shockwaves is so enormous, Japan moves 2.5 meters, and the axis of the entire planet shifts about 18 centimeters. Despite the magnitude of the quake, precautionary measures limit the damage. It appears technology has protected the Japanese, but the earthquake is just the first phase of a double disaster they're to face that day. Because the tremor has given birth to a tsunami, and it's heading towards Japan's northern coastline. Coastal engineer Alison Raby has been studying why the events of 2011 escalated into one of the worst disasters of its kind, placing it in the top 10.
We're going to simulate that megathrust type event using this hinged board down here. That's going to represent the edge of the crust that comes up in that type of rupture, and we're going to spring that plate up, and that's going to raise a huge body of water. 3, 2, 1.
In open water, the initial wave is relatively small, just a meter high. But as it approaches the shoreline and enters the shallows, it begins to slow and grow in height.
And here we recreated certain parts of the Japanese coastline.
Raby and her team have reconstructed particular towns and their defences to examine how they coped when the tsunami hit.
We start here in the city of Kamaishi. Kamaishi was a deep water port, and it had the world's deepest breakwater. This was protecting the very large steel factory and a large population. Further south we have the settlement of Minami Sanriku, and here we've recreated one of the vertical evacuation structures. This was clearly signed so that people who were on low ground could escape from the incoming wave. And then we move into the coastal plains. Now these were protected by concrete revetments, and behind that a pine forest, and those were all designed to protect the settlements behind.
The Japanese have taken a calculated risk. Their fortifications are only designed to cope with waves up to 12 meters high. (1918). A viral disease known as the Spanish flu is spreading around the globe like wildfire. Decimating every country it touches, the virus kills an estimated 30 million people in less than 6 months. And 100 years on, its deadly descendants are now one of the biggest threats we face.
The CDC is working to develop a vaccine.
We are closely monitoring the emerging cases of swine flu in the United States.
The speed with which the Spanish flu killed millions is why virologist Dr. Mike Leahy nominates it as one of the top 10 natural disasters.
By 1918, the First World War was drawing to an end. For the last 4 years, the world had been locked in conflict centred on the battlefields of Europe, with around 9 million soldiers losing their lives. But the fighters of the front line were about to face an enemy far more deadly than any human adversary.
In the spring of 1918, an influenza outbreak causes a few reported deaths. But amidst the carnage of trench warfare, such casualties are hardly a priority. Unknown to the men on the front line, the virus that causes the flu is mutating into a far deadlier strain.
When there was another outbreak of flu in the winter of the same year, it raised few alarm bells. But this time, it was different. The onset of disease was alarmingly quick, with some dying within the first 24 hours.
Even battle-hardened medics were horrified by the gruesome way the men died.
The lungs of many victims were so full of fluid they were compared by pathologists to the lungs of the drowned. It was the start of a pandemic that would affect almost every country in the world and leave tens of millions dead.
In the warring countries, news about the outbreak was limited. But the disease was heavily reported in neutral Spain, earning it the name Spanish flu. Leahy believes the conditions in the trenches could provide clues to the source of the outbreak.
The emergence of new viral diseases can often be triggered by close associations between large numbers of people and animals, such as pigs.
When humans become infected with an animal flu virus, an entirely new strain of influenza can be created.
Hence the name of outbreaks such as swine flu or bird flu. So it's not difficult to imagine that during the First World War, when large numbers of soldiers were barracked right next door to animals, often in the presence of gases that could possibly be mutagenic, a new virus could surface.
With the men crammed together, the disease tears through the ranks. In the US Army, as many as 1 million men contract the virus. But the epidemic in the trenches is only the beginning. On the 11th of November 1918, peace is declared. Returning troops unwittingly spread the disease across the globe, escalating it into a pandemic. Mass celebrations accelerate the transmission, and up to 1 billion people, half the world's population at the time, become infected.
One of the most frightening aspects of the 1918 epidemic was the way it struck people down in their prime. The death rate among 15 to 34-year-olds was around 20 times higher than that of other flus. Why was Spanish flu so deadly to those who should have been the fittest?
Breakthroughs in understanding how the virus attacks our body may provide the answer.
The key thing about Spanish flu and other severe pandemics is that the immune system attacks the lining of the lung, and that causes liquids and fluids to start to seep in. People effectively start to drown in their own fluids. It must have been horrific to experience and actually horrific to observe as well. There's lots of descriptions in the medical literature at the time of these patients slowly turning blue, and when nurses and doctors saw that, they knew it was their end.
And this wasn't something that was unique to weaker or old people, quite the opposite.
Absolutely. In fact, the fact they were young and healthy probably contributed to it, because what caused the damage to the lungs is part of the immune system, and it's called a cytokine cascade. So the immune system started to damage the lungs, and that's what allowed the liquids and the fluids to get in there and for people to actually drown.
The viral descendants of Spanish flu are still claiming lives in the 21st century. 2009, the H1N1 swine flu kills up to 500,000 people, causing the World Health Organization to raise the pandemic alert to the highest level. Swine flu is just one of many diseases that can trace their origins back to the World War I outbreak. In the summer of 1883, the Indonesian volcano KRAKATAU is becoming increasingly restless. It'll soon blow itself out of the water in a horrific spectacle that will guarantee its iconic status. Professor Nick Petford votes this first globally reported disaster into the top 10 because of the dramatic way it led to the birth of volcanology. Petford travels to where the legendary Krakatoa once stood. KRAKATAU is one of the most volcanically active places on the planet. Here, one vast tectonic plate is being pushed below another, allowing super-hot lava to surge to the surface. Since the 1950s, the volcano has grown in height by an average of 4 meters a year.
KRAKATAU is a classic cone-shaped volcano with one peak. But in 1883, the Krakatoa volcano comprised 3 separate peaks, and what people thought was that meant it was 3 small volcanoes. That was a big mistake, because underlying those volcanoes was one single magma chamber, and when it blew, the amount of energy that was released in the eruption was enough to blow the entire island apart.
At the time, there were hundreds of Europeans living in the area, trading the spices that flourished on the fertile volcanic soils.
But there was one Dutch expat in particular, a man called Roger Verbeek, a geologist. Verbeek spent the summer before the eruption of 1883 surveying the islands.
Verbeek's report would play a crucial role in establishing Krakatoa's lasting legacy. Sunday, August the 26th, 1883. The morning calm is shattered by one massive explosion after another. Clues to what the 1883 eruption would have been like can be seen on an at KRAKATAU, which is littered with huge lava bombs.
Now, this is a big piece. It's about the size of a car. And around me here there are 2 or 3 similar sized bombs. But in 1883, when KRAKATAU was in full eruption, the sky would have been full of hundreds of these sorts of bombs, flying not just hundreds of yards, but perhaps tens of miles. Literally a rain of fire falling from above.
By 2 p.m., a black cloud 3 times the height of Mount Everest surges up from the volcano.
In the immediate aftermath of the 1883 eruption, we know from eyewitness reports that the skies darkened, day turned into night. And that was because so much ash and dust was thrown up into the atmosphere. But the effects were felt farther away than just Indonesia. People talk of strange sunsets with vivid colours in London, in Paris, in New York. And all of those things were due to the volcanic eruption in 1883.
27th of August, 5 a.m. 4 monstrous eruptions rip through the volcano. The force of the blast is 13,000 times that of the bomb dropped on Hiroshima. The sound generated is the loudest in recorded history. The explosive eruptions throw out billions of tons of pulverized rock, scalding hot ash, and gas that accelerate down and away from the volcano. It's been calculated these pyroclastic flows have enough power to climb over 830 meters, twice as tall as the Empire State Building.
They might expect a pyroclastic flow when it hits the sea to stop because of the water, but that's not the case. Sometimes a pyroclastic flow, if it's strong enough and hot enough, it can hit the sea and keep on travelling. Steam forms around the front of the flow and protects it from the water. And we know this was the case in the 1883 eruption, because on that morning, villagers in a town called Ketimbang gathered to watch the spectacle.
Within minutes, the super-fast, super-hot debris crosses the 40 kilometers of water towards the residents of Ketimbang.
Probably the last thing that they ever saw was a pyroclastic flow emerging from the waves. And you don't want to get caught in one of these flows because you're simultaneously burnt, suffocated and pummeled to death by the rock.
Around 1,000 of Kettenbang's residents die instantly. And the disaster isn't finished yet. During Krakatau's final death throes, the volcano collapses into the ocean. The splash triggers a tsunami of epic proportions, traveling at 320 kilometers per hour. In its path is the small Javanese settlement of Anya. On the west coast of Java, a Dutch lighthouse, very similar to the one that stands here today, towers above the surrounding buildings. It's constructed to cope with the worst that the weather can throw at it. Even though the tsunami is heading their way, the keeper and his family choose to stay to ensure the lighthouse remains operational.
So in a building like this, made from reinforced steel, they must have felt safe, even from the most powerful of waves.
But adding to the power of the wave are huge chunks of rock torn from the seabed.
When the wave struck, it was 40 meters high. That's about 130 feet, nearly as high as I am here now. The wave ripped up from the sea floor great big lumps of coral and slammed them against the side of the lighthouse. And despite being reinforced with an iron girder, the lighthouse collapsed.
These bricks are all that remain of the ill-fated lighthouse. Miraculously, the lighthouse keeper survived, but his wife and child perished in the water, along with tens of thousands of others. It's the most destructive tsunami created by a volcano in history. As the sun sets on the 27th of August 1883, Krakatoa is no more. The volcano has blown itself out of existence.
As well as being a spectacular volcanic eruption, Krakatau is important for other reasons. Just before the eruption, undersea telegraph cables have been laid between Jakarta and the rest of the world. So as the eruption unfolded, people could follow it in real time, the same way that we would do today using the internet. So in that sense, Krakatau became the world's first globally reported disaster story.
The Dutch geologist Roger Verbeek also played a critical role in raising Krakatoa to its iconic status.
After the eruption, his report was so insightful that it laid the foundations for an entire new science, volcanology. And it's for these reasons that Krakatau is one of the top 10 natural disasters of all time.
On August the 24th, 2005, a tropical storm forms over the Bahamas. 5 days later, it will leave the city of New Orleans in ruins.
Everything was gone within a flickering of an eye.
A chain of natural events and human error will conspire to make Katrina the world's most expensive hurricane.
It's just gone.
It's for these reasons meteorologist Tim Marshall thinks this disaster should be in the top 10.
New Orleans is a city surrounded by water. 300 years ago, it was just a small settlement on the bank of the Mississippi River, high above sea level. But over time, it's expanded out into marshlands, and people now live below sea level in much of New Orleans.
With large sections of the city below the waterline, People here are particularly vulnerable to hurricanes. Because it's not just the high winds that make these weather systems so dangerous, but the body of water that's pushed before them, known as a storm surge. Many hurricane deaths are the result of drowning. On the 24th of August 2005, the National Hurricane Center is tracking the tropical storm that will become Katrina.
Katrina first formed, it was nothing really unusual. It was pretty much like any other tropical system at that point.
The storm soon intensifies to a Category 1 hurricane.
So our demeanor at that point was to treat it like a normal hurricane that we've seen many times before.
Like all hurricanes, Katrina forms as rising warm air from the sea creates strong winds and thick clouds full of moisture. Fueled by the unusually warm seas of the Gulf of Mexico, Katrina quickly grows into a much bigger and more powerful hurricane. Back at the Weather Center, Katrina looms large on the screens.
The satellite imagery revealed a huge eye. It became apparent that we were dealing with a Category 5 hurricane at this point.
The data shows Katrina will strike New Orleans in less than 24 hours.
We had to start issuing our watches and warnings and statements.
Every person is hereby ordered to immediately evacuate.
Those that can get out of town. 1 million people flee the city. But many people simply can't afford to leave. Stanley and Betty Stewart live in the lower 9th Ward.
The decision was made that we weren't going to be able to go anywhere under the financial conditions, and we elect to just stay and pray and hope for the best.
So it ended up being 13 of us in the 2 rooms, basically. All of us know we hunker down.
Up to 100,000 people are left behind to face whatever nature has to throw at them.
We padded our back door with some towels to just keep the water from actually seeping under.
With a long history of hurricane strikes, New Orleans is surrounded by 560 kilometers of protective levees.
A levee is just made of combinations of clay and sand. The big problem came with all these miles of levee, that some levees were high and some levees were low. Some were sinking.
Worse still, the levees were not built to withstand a hurricane of Katrina's intensity. The 29th of August, 6:10 a.m. Hurricane Katrina strikes land with wind speeds of 210 kilometers per hour. With waves up to 8 meters high, the largest storm surge in American history pummels the Gulf Coast. New Orleans is inundated with water.
You can actually hear the waves coming over the roof of the home.
Those stranded have little idea what to do.
Don't panic, keep the children down.
My brother, looked at me. I said, man, we just really need to pray. I said, because visually it actually looked like it was going to be your last day on earth.
2 p.m. and the residents of the lower 9th Ward are in serious trouble.
We got major flooding here. Lots of problems here, lots of problems.
Some people were actually by that time in 20 feet of water. Some of our friends that were in homes, they had loss of life.
The 30th of August. The hurricane has blown itself out. All the main communication lines are down.
Just trying to figure out, are we the only people left, or is there anybody else around?
With most of New Orleans underwater, the emergency services are left floundering.
They finally said on the radio, you've got to realize that the levee on the 17th Street Canal broke and there's water to the roofs of the houses in Lakeview. I I can tell you my life changed right at that point. Everybody didn't realize that this was a new ball game now, that now the city was flooding.
Chris and his colleagues faced a disaster of epic proportions.
Everywhere you went, you saw bodies floating. They didn't have enough coroners to come pick up the bodies.
The survivors are corralled into the New Orleans Superdome and Convention Center.
The conditions that was at the convention center was unbearable. People were thinking that they were going to go to a lit shelter where maybe there would have been food or clothing or water. It was nothing. And people were literally just abandoned out on the streets.
With over 46,000 people, some are left with little option but to fend for themselves.
People were dying for lack of resources. We were like, oh my goodness, is this the end of the earth? Is this the end of life?